So since we last spoke, you were on KMOX, and now you're in a totally different time slot and doing something different, but with the same family, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because just to offer a little perspective, because you have listeners all across the globe, Vance Crowe, KMOX is a legendary heritage radio station, as we refer to them, AM radio station, 1120 on the dial. Clear channel, which means no other radio station in the entire country is on that signal at 1120. So because of that, and because it's an AM signal, 50,000 watts, and because of the way the ionosphere works, and I can't explain this at all, the signal booms throughout much of the country. The mountains certainly interfere. So KMOX has this huge reputation throughout the Midwest and the Southeast, I would say, because it gets into all these states. So with the Cardinals affiliation, been the Cardinals flagship station for many years. There was a period in the mid-2000s where they left for a little bit. The station has this huge reputation, and I had done afternoon drive on KMOX since 2008. I came back from Milwaukee in 2006. I was working for another heritage radio station up there and needed to get down here for family reasons. That's another story with a divorce. But I had been on KMOX for all these years, doing afternoon drive, 2 to 5, and I got a call about 2.5 months ago. And it was, my boss had texted me the night before and said, hey, can we touch base tomorrow morning? I said, on what? Just a few updates.
Is that a flag?
Now,
is that a flag?
Something that's important to recognize here is that Rush Limbaugh passed away. And that's an important component in this story because Rush had been the host on KMOX in his syndicated format for decades now, from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. So he was my lead-in, which was a pretty good lead-in to have for a long time. And when Rush died, that meant that there was a slot on the station that was open between 11 and 2. Could have been syndicated, could have been local. They decided to go local. And there was an opportunity to get all the partisan political people like me off the radio station, I guess. So can I do other radio? I can. I've done a lot of different radio. In fact, my show, and you know this, Vance, I don't just talk about politics. I talk about a lot of things. But they saw it as an opportunity to move me from one station in Odyssey, that's the name of our company, used to be Entercom, to another station, 97.1 KFTK, which has been a very successful FM talk station in this market. And I was thrilled. I really was. It was a complete surprise. They flipped the show that was on that station with my show. And I started on FM radio. I started music radio in the 80s. So maybe I'm coming full circle. I'm 56 years old. All right. How old are you, Vance?
39.
Yeah. People your age and certainly younger, but also older, between, I'd say my wife's 42, the 40 to 50-year-olds, they don't know that AM radio exists. Now, in fairness, I don't think FM radio is too far behind because these types of things, podcast, streaming is taking over. That's a big portion of my show, though, because we know that a lot of the audience does come from streaming. They're not listening to it live. So, yeah, a bit of an adjustment in
for the
maybe
host,
my last 10 years of my career, but it's been a great change. For
the host, is there something different about being on FM? Do you have to change anything about what you're doing by moving from AM to FM?
It's a really good question because there's almost a different feel to it, and we call it a clock. So what we're doing here, we have no clock. We don't have to take a commercial break. We're just going to talk nonstop. Well, we have commercial breaks. That's how I get paid at the radio station. And because KMOX has this history and reputation, and it's a news station, there were things that you just didn't say or do, or veer off into maybe sophomoric takes or things along those lines, or say words that might be allowed on the radio, but maybe not appropriate for a certain audience. We call that community standards. So is there really anything different? No, it's just another radio station. But I guess when you think about it, you break it down, there are differences. And a couple of things. It's a much looser format. The audience is, we know the audience a little bit because of the politics, and it was very successful, certainly in the past 5 years because of Donald Trump. That's changing a little bit. I saw something even this week, CNN's audience is down 70%, 65%. That's a huge drop. So I guess the answer to that question would be, there is a different feel. There's a lot more looseness on the show. I have more players on the show, so I've always done solo talk show. This is more of an ensemble, and we're still kind of, evolving along those lines. I do a lot with music. I'm a big music guy. Musical guests are going to sound fantastic on the FM. I had Neil Sosik in. He's a guy that has a band here in St. Louis called the Mighty Pines. They're fantastic. And he came in, did a couple of songs before a show at the beautiful Fox Theater. So, yeah, realistically, it's just another signal. It's just an FM station, but there is a different vibe to it, if you will.
You know, I think there's something really important about radio that people don't realize we're giving up when you switch to podcasts. Because when you have a podcast, you have to know what you're looking for. It's very hard for you to just be like, oh, I'm going to randomly flip this thing on and experience somebody new and different. Whereas with radio, you're kind of like dancing along the dial. You're in your car. You're like, hey, what's going to be the most interesting thing that I can encounter? And so it's like being a part of a community. You don't always know what you're going to get. You aren't choosing it. And so I think that there is some blending of importance with how do you have that level of novelty that comes from turning on the radio, because you just don't get it with podcasts.
Yeah, and you know what you just described is something that sometimes happens, certainly in this era, very fast. In other words, and I've kind of joked about this over the years, but when my show starts at 3 o'clock right now, so let's use an example of today. As we're recording this in the midday and my show's a little later, I have a certain amount of things that I know I'm going to talk about today. We have the show formatted out. I have a few guests, but it wouldn't take a whole lot for something to happen at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 2:45. And in the era of Trump, things would happen all the time, right before the show started. So you had to shift gears. I'm constantly shifting gears, and there are things that I planned on doing that I won't do, and maybe it gets delayed a day or two. Maybe we just sort of move on from that topic because it doesn't come as timely. But that's one of the things that I've always been attracted to with radio, is that newness and that freshness. And, you know, when I did morning radio, it was fun because you're telling people things that they hadn't heard for the first time, especially when I did morning radio, you know, 2 decades ago, because you didn't have your phone to look at, right? So we couldn't look at Twitter in the morning and say, okay, here are the stories of the day. Here's what I missed. You had to turn on the radio when you went to work in the morning. And in the afternoon, it's a little bit of a different approach where, you know, now I have stories that people have heard from the day before. I'm looking at stories that people are going to be talking about tomorrow, right? So if the topics that I choose, I don't know that I don't make these decisions this way, but I'm always kind of happy if Hannity or Tucker Carlson or someone on CNN or MSNBC, if they're hitting that topic that night, well, then that kind of becomes the morning topic, right? For everyone that does talk shows and things along those lines. I try to stay ahead of the curve on that and find out what's going on. Things change all the time, as you know. I mean, I could be doing the show today at 4 o'clock, 4:30, boom, there's another story, and then we jump on that. And that's something that radio can do that television can't do. Television can do it with pictures, you know, you got a fire or something like that. Television does a much better job, but radio can be right on top of something very quickly. And I like that. And you're right, podcasts can't really do that. They can analyze after the fact, which I do like the longer format.
Well, and you can have local or specific podcasts, but they don't have the same salience as the speed with which what you're talking about. And like, this has actually changed, I think, our culture in our American society, is that so few people have access to regular local news that you think of ourselves as one giant country. And so we're paying attention to one national story, whereas you're like, hey, I also have to include things that are going on, you know, down the street from the studio.
Well, that's one of the things that local radio does, and that's what I do, because I do obviously handle a lot of national topics, but we have the local spin on them. So it's interesting, but what you just described, I think, is also just going to keep getting worse, because local journalism and real journalism is just disappearing because of budgets and the way everything's changing. So I don't know how that kind of works itself out, because we're going to really miss stories in the future that people should know locally, of abuse, corruption, even positive stories that won't be told because you don't have enough good journalists out there. You have all these formats that are spread out, but local newspapers are dying. To a certain extent, local radio stations don't have the audience that they used to, so it's problematic, I think.
Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you like this interview, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and hit that bell so you always get notified about this podcast. And if you're really interested in conversations like this, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. To find out more, go to network.articulate.ventures.